In video 2, I'm going to share some information that I've extracted from a proof argument I wrote on the identity of Thomas O'Connor. And in this video, I will outline who I believe to be the most likely candidate to be the biological father of Lillian, Mary Ellen, and Thomas. Now, over the years, I have revisited this proof argument multiple times to challenge my own findings. But the overall conclusions have remained the same. Now, late in the summer of 2019, I had some upcoming work to do in Franklin. Because I knew I was going to be within about a 5-minute drive of my mother's oldest brother, Tommy, I made arrangements to pay a visit to my aunt and uncle. During our visit, I shared some old photographs as well as the proof argument. Now, Tommy was fascinated by the information, but he was not able to shed any new light. And shortly after this visit, I heard from his daughter. Tommy wanted to see me again as he had something he wanted to share. That second visit occurred in the early fall. When I entered the house, Tommy was sitting at the dining room table sorting puzzle pieces, and he was excited to see me, but he did seem a bit surprised. He had no recollection of asking me to stop by. So at this point, I just figured we would have a nice visit. Tommy began telling me about how they were cleaning the basement and getting things were organized, and he was clearly proud of the work, and he wanted to show it off. But because he was now on oxygen, he needed help to navigate the staircase. And as we reached his office, he sat down at his desk and he began to explain what they were working on. And a few minutes later, he opened the top drawer, and he removed what would charitably be called a scrap of paper. And his eyes went wide. And as I waited for him to form his thoughts, I glanced at this piece of paper. And to me, it just looked like complete gibberish. But in the blink of an eye, Tommy transported himself back in time to when he was 11 years old. He was standing inside a Brookdale cemetery with his father. And on that day, Tommy and his father went to the cemetery to visit Tommy's younger brother that we know as Baby Paul. But there was a problem. Apparently, the cemetery was clearing land and they were expanding the physical footprint. And in this process, the cemetery had lost Baby Paul. Now, the story is common knowledge in the family, but this version was a first-hand account from one of the two people that had been present that day. Overall, the basics of the story were the same, but I think some of these memories have been locked away in Tommy's subconscious for quite some time, perhaps even decades. Now, eventually the cemetery did locate Baby Paul, and as compensation to my grandfather, they asked him to go out and pick any lot in the cemetery, and that would become the O'Connor family lot, and that the cemetery would maintain it in perpetuity. Now, throughout the afternoon of my visit, Tommy continued telling stories. And at times he would grow quite animated as these childhood memories came into focus. And at one point he recalled a conversation that he had with his grandfather, William Walker. William had sat him down so that he could tell him about his biological grandfather, Thomas O'Connor. And William described Thomas as his best friend. Now, although the detail doesn't seem significant, it does shed light on the overall analysis contained in my proof argument. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, a marriage record between Thomas O'Connor and Medea Sebastian has not been located. So the next step was to locate a death record. Now, names like Thomas James O'Connor are quite common, but Medea Sebastian is genealogical gold. There is only one documented case of a Medea Sebastian in New England, and that is my great-grandmother. When analyzing records for Medea, due diligence is always performed, but ultimately it is not difficult to connect her back to the family. So my hope was perhaps a death certificate could be located that would name Medea as the wife of Thomas. Now, over many months, I looked at every possible Thomas James O'Connor, including all different kinds of spelling variations and name alterations. And I looked across all 6 New England states. There were hundreds of potential candidates, and I reviewed thousands of documents. And one by one, I was able to eliminate each of these possible candidates, with the exception of one record. Now, to be clear, I could not conclusively prove that this record was the correct Thomas O'Connor. But equally important, it was the only record that I was unable to disprove as being the correct Thomas. So at a minimum, it was at least possible that I had identified the correct Thomas. And this is that record. Now in green, I have highlighted the expected results. We have the correct name, he's married, the occupation is what we would expect, the birth location is what we would expect. And then in yellow, I've highlighted details that seem plausible. You know, he died in a state hospital, and the burial location makes sense. Now on this death certificate, the informant is a gentleman named Dr. Arthur Ball. So he provides the information for this certificate. And unfortunately, there's no spousal information provided. But Thomas was only in this hospital for 5 days. So it is unlikely that Thomas had any kind of personal relationship with the doctor. Now, the cause of death is shown as general paralysis of insane. And he apparently had this condition for 3 months. Now, if this Thomas had been struck by a train, as the oral history indicates, it would suggest that the accident occurred sometime in January or February. Now, the residence here says Chicopee Falls rather than Boston. However, based on the totality of information on this death certificate, it is at least plausible that this is the correct Thomas. Now, when building a circumstantial case, we need to take the events and put them in context to the time and place. So some facts that I wanted to consider. Chicopee and the surrounding area are the home to many Irish immigrants, and that name Thomas O'Connor is rather common. But his occupation, generalized as working with automobiles, is not very common at the time of Lillian's birth. So a Thomas J. O'Connor removing from Chicopee to Boston to work as a chauffeur or mechanic is an important clue. Now, I researched every O'Connor family in Chicopee with a particular focus on Chicopee Falls, and I found no alternative Thomas O'Connor from Chicopee that worked with automobiles at that time that could have been this same Thomas O'Connor. Now, as I did my research, it brought me to the Boston Public Library. And in the reading room, there's a series of old phone books and city directories. And I reviewed these city directories for Thomas O'Connor, William Walker, and the Sebastian family. And the results were quite helpful. Because from these directories, I was able to narrow down the number of individuals that were named Thomas O'Connor in Boston at the time of his children's births that could possibly be our great-grandfather to 3. Of these 3 individuals, they appeared in these directories together. And through the locations shown on the children's birth records, I was able to identify R. Thomas. The other 2 potential candidates were researched, and they were eliminated as being this Thomas on the death certificate shown because they were still living in Boston after the year 1915. R. Thomas, however, never appears in another city directory. Now, as I stitched together the different fragments of evidence, I had to look at some other pieces of information, including some that maybe had some problems to them. And so I turned to the obituaries. Now, this first obituary appears to be the same individual that died at the state hospital in Northampton. But obituaries can contain errors and omissions. The death certificate clearly shows that Thomas died in the state hospital and not in Chicopee. But the obituaries can provide clues. 5 siblings are mentioned: Patrick, Michael, John, James, and Nellie. and a daughter is mentioned, Myrtle. There's a specific address here, 67 Charles Street. But this wasn't the only obituary for Thomas. There was another one published in Springfield the same day. And on this obituary, we see the same 5 siblings and a daughter. And both obituaries indicate some problems with this being our guy because there's no wife mentioned. And there's only one child, and the name is completely unfamiliar to me. But this obituary does place him in Boston, and he's working as a chauffeur. Now, from my research, there is only one Thomas J. O'Connor employed as a chauffeur or a similar occupation in Boston at the time that could possibly be my great-grandfather. Now, I can't explain the lack of a spouse here or the name of the child, but it is possible that this is my great-grandfather. This is just one piece of evidence. It neither proves nor disproves that this is the correct Thomas O'Connor. So my next steps were really to focus on the address that's shown, 67 Charles Street. And as I do, I come across a marriage record. And this is for a Thomas J. O'Connor that marries Ruby E. Flint. Now, Thomas is living at 67 Charles Street, the same address shown on the obituary. He's born in Chicopee. He's 22 years old. His parents are listed as James O'Connor and Margaret Fitzgerald, the same parents shown on the death certificate. Ruby Flint, 21, she's born in Chicopee, and she's living on Stockbridge Street in Springfield. She's the daughter of Dwight Flint and Josephine Sullivan. Now, this marriage takes place at the Cathedral of St. Michael's, which is in Springfield, on the 30th of June, 1903. Now, this date is important because less than 3 weeks later, Ruby Flint, the wife of Thomas O'Connor, gives birth to an unnamed daughter. Thomas and Ruby were living at this point at 19 Stockbridge Street in Springfield, the same address that was shown on the marriage record. So could this unnamed child be the Myrtle that's named in the obituary? So as I continue looking for that 67 Charles Street, I focus on census records. And here we come to the O'Connor household at 67 Charles Street in Chicopee in 1910. Now, the enumerator here has indicated the house is located at 67 Muzzy Street, but this is incorrect. And I've included a small map on the side to explain what happened. So as the enumerator proceeded north on Muzzy Street, he turned right onto Charles Street, and he forgot to list the new street name on this census record. But we have been able to identify each of the other households, so there is no question that this address is, in fact, 67 Charles Street. Now, the head of household here is listed as James. Presumably, this would be the James listed on Thomas's death certificate. 2 children are in the household, Nellie and Daniel. Nellie is named in the obituary. And there is a granddaughter named Myrtle. So this Myrtle would have been born around 1903. So it is possible this daughter is the same Myrtle that's mentioned in Thomas's obituary. Now, if we assume that this Myrtle is that unnamed daughter, where are Thomas and Ruby? Now, Thomas was not enumerated in any census in 1910. However, we know where he was living at the time, because the city directories from Boston show that in 1910, Thomas was a boarder at 2040 Washington Street. This is the same apartment building where the Sebastian family was residing. And now we know where Thomas and Medea met. And at the same time, William Walker is also nearby. He's living in the same community of Roxbury. And so we start to connect these different individuals geographically. Now, over time, I've researched all members of this O'Connor household. as well as Ruby Flint's family. And I reached the following conclusion in my proof argument. Although a circumstantial case, I believe I have successfully identified my great-grandfather, Thomas James O'Connor. When I put all the evidence together, I would categorize my conclusions as more likely true than not. And so now I can share an updated family tree. And this tree is a working tree, and it's based on the circumstantial case that I had identified the correct Thomas. And it will be updated again in the next video as I share the results of the DNA analysis.